Welcome to the AACFB's 2023 Meet the Funder webinar series. My name is Monica Harper, and I'm the Executive Director of the AACFB. I'll be your host today. Our presenter today is John Hollander from TradeRiver USA. TradeRiver is both a funding source member and a gold sponsor of the AACFB, and I'd like to thank them for their support of the association. Before I introduce TradeRiver, I'd like to go over a few items to make this webinar more enjoyable and informative for everyone. During the presentation, you should see a Q&A box that allows you to ask questions. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit your questions in the box and they'll be answered by the end of the webinar. Please reserve the chat for communication between attendees. The entire webinar should take no more than 30 to 45 minutes. For those of you who would like to review this at a later date, it will be posted on the 2023 Meet the Funder page of the website and will be emailed out to the AACFB membership. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to John. It is all yours.
Thank you very much, Monica. And hello, AACFB community. It's nice to be with you. I am going to share my screen and jump right into TradeRiver. I may have seen many of you or some of you at the AACFB conference in Irvine in May last month. But for those of you that were there, it was a wonderful conference. What I'm going to drill down on now is how we can work with equipment lease brokers that tend to focus in that area and brokers of all stripes to provide a product that is in really great demand among companies in the US and Canada. Basically, I want to work with, we're here to serve you and your clients. Chuck Brazier and myself are the primary fronts for the company that work with the brokers. The things that, who we are and the things that we do, we're a developer of a platform called STEPS, Secure Transaction Execution Platform, where clients can execute trade finance transactions to pay their suppliers and accelerate their receivables, really to fund their supply chain once we've set them up as a client. It's unique in the industry. It allows us to do some things that put the client in a very good position. We work with A, B, and C credit level clients. That's important to note. We do want to work with companies that have experience, but pretty much can do most credit levels. And we provide a working capital solution that bridges the revenue cycle between payables and receivables. The team at TradeRiver, we have quite a bit of trade finance and banking experience in our company. And we have a unique approach that is really powerful for the clients that we work with. So what do? We provide production finance, purchase order finance solutions. We can offer invoice discounting, but we're not per se a factor. In many cases, we will work with factors on the receivable side. If a client has an existing factor, or we'll bring a factor in to do that end of the equation. We provide supply chain finance, and we have a platform that automates the transaction and funding process. So we're automating it. We're putting a client in a cash position to pay their suppliers and accelerate their receivables. So the benefits to clients are that we're putting them in a cash position at the earliest point in their acquisition or purchasing process. We can fund very early purchase deposits to get production started all the way through the final payment. And we'll do that in cash, and we'll fund 100% of that payable to their suppliers, their vendors. What this does, it helps clients fulfill larger orders. There's less of a need for the company to put additional owner equity or get additional debt funding into the company. They can actually do it through the strength of their supply chain on the receivable side. We give them a great deal of flexibility to manage payments and receivables, so they can manage where they want to, where they need to get funding in the supply chain. And our process is very simple and transparent. We have a single transaction fee with a client. We don't have a myriad of various fees for origination and startup, wire transfer fees and the like. So for a client, it's very, very simple and transparent. And we streamline their transaction process. We work with the clients we work with, come from a really large, broad swath of industries. We work with manufacturers, importers, wholesalers, many companies that are buying products and selling them to distributors or directly to companies in the US and Canada. We work with brands, we work with distribution and logistics. So, I guess I'll give you some examples later, but there's really quite a large swath of types of companies we can work with. And many of these companies are going to be companies that you're already working with on equipment lease, for example. It may be a company that you're leasing forklifts or trucking equipment, or you've helped them get into a commercial warehouse facility. Many times those companies also need a facility to buy product, and they need to bridge that revenue cycle so they can grow the business. So that's where we would come in. The companies we work with are US and Canadian based, or a subsidiary of a foreign company. We have a London, UK affiliate that does the same thing for the UK market. We'd like to see a company with at least 20% or greater gross profit margin on the products they're buying and selling. No outstanding judgments, tax liens. And the sweet spot really for revenue would be companies ranging from $1 million to $100 million in annual revenue. We will work with startup companies as long as that management team has prior trading experience. They've at least transacted some transactions, and hopefully have prior business experience that gives them the competence we want to see in the supply chain. And companies that need purchase tranches from $25,000 up to $5 million will fit for TradeRiver. The other kind of a key determinant is the number of days in the revenue cycle, a client's revenue cycle, between the payments they have to lay out to get, let's say they're buying a piece of equipment to come into the US, and it's going to be leased. For example, this would be an example for an equipment lease broker. We can bridge that initial period up to 120 days or 150 days in some cases. So we're looking at that accounts payable through accounts receivable cycle being within that 150-day period window. And then clients needing trade facilities or funding in their supply chain between $250,000 up to $25 million is the TradeRiver funding facility range. If we're relying on the end buyer customer as the takeout on the receivable side, they also would need to be a US or Canadian company and have fairly strong credit. So that would allow us, in this case, to work with maybe a C credit company that had a strong cycle. They under a strong process in their supply chain, but maybe they weren't keeping a lot of equity in the business. If they have a good a strong end buyer customer, we can use that as the takeout, allowing us to fund those companies. TradeRiver's credit and onboarding process for a client is very straightforward. We have a credit application and a personal financial statement form that the client can fill out, or you can use your own form for that. We will do a preliminary review. Many times our clients will want to be engaged in that process. They might want to jump on a call with us and the client initially. but you can just hand a potential client off to TradeRiver and we'll run with it if you prefer. We do collect a full financial package from the company, and I'll get into that a bit more. And then we're looking at, their supply chain. That'll be part of the submittal package as well, documents that tell us how their supply chain works. We will, once a client's approved, they've agreed to the term letter, we will enroll them on the STEPS platform. That's done online, and we will enroll their suppliers as well, so they can transact directly with suppliers, transact and fund, their purchase transactions. So the enrollment process, or really the whole transaction process is, once a client, once a client is enrolled and we've onboarded them on STEPS, they can transact directly with their supplier. That's done through the platform. They will certify all the steps in the process. They'll certify the purchase order that's entered when they enter a transaction, when they start a transaction. The supplier will accept that and will certify dispatch. Client will certify receiving and accepting the goods, and they can accept the goods in any point in the supply chain. So it could actually be while the goods are still in raw material form, for example, in the supplier's warehouse, or in the case of a piece of equipment, it could be while the equipment is offshore before you can actually execute an equipment lease on a piece of equipment. We'll fund the equipment pre-shipment, and then you can take out TradeRiver when it arrives. So that's a good example of how we can work with equipment lease folks. The TradeRiver will fund, and then repayment needs to happen within 120 days, but that's on a revolving basis. So a client could have, for example, $1 million revolving trade facility, execute 4 or 5 transactions, and still have the facility for use on a revolving basis. We offer 3 programs, and as I said earlier, we really fund and bridge the entire length of the supply chain. So our trade finance program combines both our buyer program and our seller program, which are number 2 and 3 and 2. And we combine them in a way that allows the client to fund the early part of the supply chain, to get products in that they need to complete their production cycle, and get to the invoice. When the invoice is accepted by the end buyer, it has been assigned to TradeRiver, and then we will take out we will pay down the buyer program. If the end buyer customer has terms with the client, we will enter them in the receivable program, which is the seller first program, so that we can fund the receivable as well. And this is what it looks like from a graphic standpoint. So you have the client company in the center, the buyer program on the top of this graph, and the seller first program on the bottom, where there would be a transaction digitally on the platform. We would fund that payment to the supplier in cash, putting the client in a cash position, and we'll fund up to 100% of that purchase. So let's say the client needs to buy $100,000 of product to fulfill a $150,000 purchase order from their end buyer customer, which is under the seller first program on the bottom. So we'll fund that transaction to purchase the product. When the goods arrive and the invoice is accepted by the end buyer, TradeRiver will pay down that first program, and we will convert it to a receivable program. Now, that receivable could be through the client's factor. They have an existing factor, for example, we would have an intercreditor agreement with that factor. They may have an asset-based lender, or for example, an inventory lender. We could work with that company as the takeout under that seller first program side. So in essence, we're allowing the company to fulfill their growth potential without the need to add owner equity or additional investment into the company. And that is really providing something many of your clients probably are not aware of. Their trade finance and supply chain finance, purchase order finance is not as common as people looking for example, a working capital facility, or they're just looking for some means of getting additional funding into the company so they can do this. They don't actually realize they have a supply chain that's a good fit for trade finance without the need to give up equity in their company. So this is a good example. This is a sample supply chain, and it's a sample of supply chain funding critical path where you may have, for example, in this case, you have a customer, a client that's putting a purchase deposit of 30% down when they place an order with their supplier. Now they may have a large purchase order from their end buyer customer that they need to fulfill, or they might just be looking to fill inventory, but they need to fund that production cycle. So there's 30% paid to the manufacturer or supplier that they're purchasing from. We'll call them a seller in this case. The client is a buyer. So the TradeRiver will fund that deposit at day one. In 4 weeks after production is finished, there's a 70% final payment that has to be made before product ships. TradeRiver will also fund that in cash. And then there's in this case, a 4-week shipping period before an invoice can be generated. When the product lands in the US, an invoice is generated. It can be converted, as I said earlier, it can be converted at that stage from the buyer program to the seller first program. And that would bring the rate down. The risk is lower. The rate will be lower. Then we have the receivable side. On that side, TradeRiver can fund that invoice, or there may be, as I said earlier, a factor that's going to handle that end of it, in which case the payment of that invoice will be assigned to TradeRiver. We will fund out, as I said, we'll fund out the buyer program when the invoice is accepted, and we'll hold the receivable until the final payment is made by the end buyer customer. So this is just an example. And in this case, final payment is made at week 16 and week 19, 2 different timing cycles. Monica, any questions yet? Just checking in. I think I see one. How do you vet the vendor supplier? Okay. All right. So there's really not a great deal of vetting of the vendor supplier. In this case, we will want to know that the supplier, the client has made purchases from that supplier in the past. If we're just looking at the we will want to see any certifications. If there's, for example, a purchase order, and I'm going to go back to this slide here. Let's say there's a purchase order from an end buyer customer, and the client needs to fund the supplier. We're just going to verify that there's been a past transaction, at least one or several transactions, and that supplier is manufacturing to the specs required by the end buyer, and that the end buyer, that a transaction cycle has been completed in the past. What we're really looking at, though, is the performance history of the client company within the supply chain, and that they have a reliable, respectable credit end buyer customer that will be making the final payment at the end of the cycle. So I hope that answers the question. How does the STEPS platform work? It's really the automation of the supply chain transaction and funding process. So if you think of it as containing all of the steps of a purchase and sale transaction, from the earliest purchase order that's entered through each and every step of that transaction cycle, dispatch, certification of receipt of goods and acceptance of goods by the buyer, and then the issuance of a payment obligation by the seller and the acceptance of that payment obligation by the end buyer, creates an instrument that we call a CPO, a confirmed payment obligation, which we can literally take to the bank, and we do. We can collect on that instrument because it's a firm commitment, and it locks down a transaction between the buyer and the seller through the process, with each step digitally signed, certified, and there being an audit trail. So the platform, it just really simplifies and consolidates all the steps in one transaction, giving our clients and their suppliers much greater confidence that this is a solid transaction, that cash payment will be made to the supplier when that transaction is completed. Really puts the client in a cash position, allowing them to have kind of all the benefits of being a cash buyer with their supplier. We work pretty much exclusively through partners and which we call introducers. We're very hands-on in terms of training and working with partners so that they understand the program and how to sell what TradeRiver offers, the right places to look for, and the right questions to ask your clients, so that you can ferret out whether they're in need of, or they would benefit from a facility, a trade finance facility. So we welcome inquiries and questions. And what I'm going to do is talk about a couple of examples at this point, and then answer any additional questions that you guys might have. So again, we offer a buyer and a seller program, which we call our trade finance program, and we combine those two. This is a client that is in the LED display and assembly business. They contract with companies that tend to have very strong credit. They may be a hospital organization. Recently, this client did a pretty big project at MGM in Las Vegas for signage and LED displays. And what they'll do is they'll get a purchase order, but they'll need to then mobilize and fund the purchase of these LED displays and the graphics and all the equipment that goes into that, as well as any subcontractors that they need to hire to get the project done. And they have a $5 million facility they use on a revolving basis with TradeRiver. So it allows them, to take the larger purchase orders and continue to grow the business beyond what their bank or their asset-based lenders would allow the company to do. And it was a great solution for them. They make a very strong gross profit margin in the 35 to 40% range. So it makes perfect sense for them to fund, maybe pay 3 or 4% or 5% to bridge the initial gap in the supply chain, and then have the time they need to get to the invoice stage and get paid by the end buyer. So in this case, we have both programs in place with the client. We fund the early part. The invoice is assigned to TradeRiver. When that invoice is issued to the end buyer customer, we pay down the buyer program, converts to the seller program, which is a lower rate, and then we'll hold that receivable until the final payment. But we advance the invoice funds to the client, just holding back a typical 10% or 15% of invoice. This is another company that's they're actually a luxury spa manufacturer that's been a client for quite a few years. They initially, when we started working with them, they were, I think, probably less than 10 million in annual sales. We gave them a $500,000 facility, and that's grown over the years to over $2 million, actually $2 million today. And they'll buy. They have a specialty kind of spa equipment that they manufacture. They buy product components from China and other Asian markets. At this stage, a lot of manufacturing production is being reshored over to Vietnam or Malaysia and other places. And then we'll bridge that period 90 to 120 days until they can pay out the receivable. It's a buyer. This is a buyer program. But what I would like to do is answer any last questions you guys have, and kind of drill down on the kinds of questions that to ask when you're qualifying a client in your supply chain. And there's a question: can I provide a copy of the presentation? Yeah, there's going to be a copy of the presentation made available through AACFB, and it'll be, I think, posted on their website, if I'm not mistaken, Monica.
Yes, it will be on the AACFB website. Members can get there by going to the education tab and then clicking on the 2023 Meet the Funder series. And then we also have it on our YouTube channel. And whenever you see the emails from us about the Meet the Funder webinar series, you can click on a view link from that email as well. So lots of different ways you can access it.
Okay. So just the last thing I want to leave you with is every company out there has a supply chain of one form or another. Okay, where they're buying product or services or inputs to make their finished product. The key for supply chain finance or trade finance or purchase order finance, if it could go under any of those brands, right, is that the client is purchasing a product or service to fill a purchase order and continue to grow the business, and that the product is they need funding within the supply chain in order to meet demand. So maybe the company has grown beyond the constraints of the bank credit line that they have, and they need to have additional funding to meet growing demand from their end buyer customers. So that's a sign that you probably have someone that could be a good candidate for trade finance. And the questions to ask are, how do you fund inventory? How do you pay for your inventory? What products and services are you purchasing? And what are the sizes of those transactions? And then how long does it take for you to get paid or for you to close the loop until you have a receivable out of that production process? So again, we're looking at, we want to understand the client's critical path. So if they have payments that have to go out in order to meet production, to satisfy an end buyer customer purchase order, that's a perfect candidate for purchase order finance, which is where the term purchase order finance comes from. It's that purchase order from the end buyer customer that needs to be filled. Production needs to be filled. And this is a tool to do that. But probably more relevant to you guys would be you try to understand your clients, what your client is producing, what they're manufacturing and selling. Find out how they're currently funding that. They're funding it out of working capital, and then try to find out what their pain points are. Are they able to fill all the demand they have for production for their product through their existing working capital facilities or their existing out of cash flow? So once you've established that they have growth opportunities that they can't meet, or they have large purchase orders that they have to walk away from because they don't have the funding in their supply chain, you really have a good opportunity, and you might be able to provide them with the right product. And specific to equipment lease brokers, to many of you, a lot of times equipment lease companies will come across an issue where they can meet part of a client's need for equipment lease, but there may be a piece of equipment overseas in Germany, for example, or somewhere around the world that has to be paid for before it ships. So it has to be paid for at the export terminal. And there's a gap between when that payment happens and when you can actually put a lease on the equipment, and it has to be bridged. So we've worked with many clients to do that. A number of clients, I won't say many, but we worked with a number of clients over the years in order to bridge that gap in the equipment leasing cycle. So that would be one opportunity you guys might come across on a regular basis. I see there's one more question here. Let me just. I think we already answered that. Can we provide a copy of the presentation? And the answer is yes. Monica explained how to do that. So if there aren't any other questions at this point, I'm just going to kind of wrap up. Monica, let me.
Yeah.
Just advance to the final screen where we show you our contact information. Okay, so you can reach me at, actually, I prefer you reach me at my direct number, which is 410-646-8340. Again, 410-646-8340. The number there on the screen is my mobile number. And I get a lot of spam calls. Or email me at johnhollander@TradeRiverUSA.com, or you can reach out to Chuck. Monica, do you want to wrap it up?
Sure. Since there's no more questions, we'll end the webinar. I want to say a big thanks to all our participants, and especially our valued funding source member and gold sponsor, TradeRiver USA. Thanks for a great job. We invite everyone to meet with TradeRiver USA in person at the Commercial Financing Expo coming up this September in Orlando, Florida. Thanks again, and have a great day.
Thanks a lot, Monica. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.